Have you ever felt like something is holding you back, preventing you from moving forward, even though you know that God has something greater for your life? Maybe it's the fear of the future, guilt from the past, the opinions of others, or even that inner voice that insists on telling you that you're not good enough. The problem is not just the barrier itself but the time we spend focusing on it, without realizing that God has already given us everything we need to move forward. What is holding you back today may be exactly what God wants to remove to take you to a new level. The truth is that many people live imprisoned without even realizing it. Sometimes it's not a visible chain but a mindset, a cycle of doubts, insecurity, and lack of faith. Moses felt trapped by his limitations when God called him to free Israel. David could have remained stuck in the rejection of his own family. Peter could have drowned in guilt after denying Jesus. But do you know what made the difference? They decided to break free from what was holding them back and trust that God had something greater. And that decision changed everything. How many opportunities have been lost because someone believed more in their fears than in God's promises? How many doors remained closed because doubt spoke louder than faith? The prison that keeps you from moving forward today may be just an illusion sustained by the wrong thoughts. The enemy knows that if he can keep someone imprisoned in their mind, he can steal their dreams, courage, and the identity that God has already given them. But the good news is that you don't have to live like this. There is a path to freedom. And that path is not in trying to control everything or seeking the approval of others. It lies in truly trusting God, letting go of the chains of the past, and moving forward even without understanding all the details. What God has for your life is greater than any obstacle, any criticism, or any mistake you've made so far. But to live that, you must decide. Remain trapped or take a step of faith. What will you choose? Many people look at their past and believe it defines who they are. But the truth is that God does not choose based on someone's history but on the purpose He has already written. Moses, for example, questioned his ability when God called him. He doubted, looked at his limitations, and tried to justify his lack of preparation. But God did not call him because of who he was, but because of what he could do through him. The same is true today. Someone's past or background does not determine their future when God is in control. How many times has someone felt unqualified for a mission because they carried a history of failures or insecurities? This is common. But what defines a calling is not human limitations but God's grace that equips. Moses was not a great speaker, but God gave him words. David was just a shepherd, but God anointed him as king. If God entrusts something to someone, He Himself provides the resources and abilities necessary to fulfill that purpose. All it takes is trust. A practical example of this is the stories of people who have overcome humble beginnings or immense challenges before finding their purpose. Think of that speaker who once lived in poverty and against all odds, achieved success because he held on to faith and worked hard. He did not allow his background to define his destiny. The same happens spiritually. Those who choose to trust in God's plan regardless of circumstances, see doors open where there were once only walls. But there is an important detail. Trusting in God's plan does not mean everything will be easy. Moses had to face Pharaoh, David had to flee for years before becoming king, and Joseph was betrayed and imprisoned before ruling Egypt. The process can be difficult, but faithfulness to God turns hardships into stepping stones for something greater. That's why giving up cannot be an option. The path may seem uncertain, but if God has promised something, He will fulfill it at the right time. Some people get lost because they wait to feel ready before taking action, but that feeling never comes. Moses didn't feel prepared, but he went anyway. Abraham left his homeland without knowing where he was going. Faith requires bold steps even when everything seems uncertain. The secret is not in feeling qualified but in obeying. Those who choose to follow God's voice, even with doubts, will see results they could never achieve alone. Another common mistake is believing that the past is a sentence. People who have made mistakes think they are unworthy of a new beginning. But the Bible is full of men and women whose lives were transformed when they decided to trust in God. Who would have thought that a former persecutor of the church like Paul would become one of the greatest apostles? God does not see a record of the past but the potential of the future. If He calls someone, it's because He has something great prepared. The great lesson is that God does not choose the qualified, He qualifies the chosen. This means that anyone, regardless of their history, can be used by Him in extraordinary ways. It doesn't matter what happened before, what was lost, or how many times someone has failed. When God writes a new page, the past ceases to be an obstacle and becomes a testimony. The secret is to trust, move forward, and let Him lead the journey. If there is something that can keep a person from living God's purpose, it is listening to those who do not understand that purpose. From an early age, we learn that there will always be someone to doubt, criticize, or downplay what we do. But the truth is that other people's opinions do not define anyone. Joseph had a great dream, but his own brothers mocked him. David was ridiculed before defeating Goliath. Even Jesus was discredited in his own town. So why seek approval from those who cannot see what God has already placed in your heart? It's incredible how a single negative word can undermine someone's confidence. Sometimes just one ironic comment is enough to make someone doubt themselves. But if Moses had given up for fear of what others thought, Israel would never have left Egypt. If Noah had listened to the critics, he wouldn't have built the ark. Great achievements only happen when God's voice speaks louder than the voices around us. That's why those who want to fulfill a calling must learn to filter what they hear. An interesting case is that of people who were doubted at the beginning of their journeys and today inspire millions. Think of that preacher who received a wave of criticism when he posted his first sermon online but remained faithful to what God called him to do. Today his messages reach the world. If he had listened to the critics, he would have buried his gift. That's why ignoring the wrong opinions can be the difference between failure and success. This does not mean we should never listen to advice. There is a big difference between constructive criticism and a discouraging attack. Advice that builds up comes from people who genuinely want to see others grow. On the other hand, criticism that only tears down says more about the person speaking than the one listening. And many times, the harshest criticism comes from those who never had the courage to do something great themselves. So why let those voices guide your path? David could have believed he was not capable when his brothers despised him. But he ignored their mockery and faced Goliath with faith. Joseph could have held a grudge against his brothers for doubting him, but he remained faithful and eventually ruled Egypt. What do these stories teach us? That the opinions of others may be loud, but they should not be our compass. God sees the heart and equips those who stand firm, regardless of what others say. Another essential point is understanding that not everyone celebrates the success of others. Many times, the resistance someone faces has nothing to do with their ability but with the insecurity of those who criticize. It is easier to belittle someone else's dream than to admit being trapped by the fear of trying. But those who understand that their calling comes from God and not from men keep moving forward and overcome the barriers created by negative words. In the end, what truly matters is the inner conviction that God has a plan. If He gave a purpose, He Himself will open the doors. Criticism will come, negative comments will arise, but none of that should stop someone from pressing on. The key is not in trying to please everyone but in pleasing the one who called. When a person learns to ignore distractions and focuses on what truly matters, they become unstoppable. Faith has always been the driving force behind those who accomplish great things. But it is not enough just to believe, obedience is required. Moses held a simple staff in his hands, But when God told him to throw it on the ground, something supernatural happened. The staff turned into a serpent. This proves that faith without action is incomplete. How many times has someone prayed for a miracle but hesitated when it was time to take the necessary step? God does not just speak, He expects a response. Obedience is the link between the promise and its fulfillment. Many people want to see change in their lives but are unwilling to step out of their comfort zones. True faith requires movement. Noah built the ark before he saw the rain. Abraham left his homeland without knowing where he was going. Peter walked on water because he responded to Jesus' call. Faith is more than beautiful words. It is acting as if the promise is already a reality. God honors those who, even without seeing the full path, obey and take the first step. A real-life example of this can be seen in stories of ministries that started small, without resources or support, but grew because someone trusted in their calling and took action. A pastor who once preached to just a few people but remained faithful may see his ministry expand to reach thousands. And it all started with one step of obedience. The same applies to any area of life. God does not need someone to have everything ready. He only needs a willing heart to obey. It is interesting to notice that many people wait for a grand sign before obeying, but God often works through simple instructions. Moses merely lifted his staff and the sea parted. Elisha's servants simply dug ditches in the desert, and the water came. God's answer is not always spectacular at first glance, but obedience opens doors to miracles. The problem is that many give up because they do not see immediate results. But those who learn to trust, even when nothing seems to be happening, reap blessings beyond human understanding. Another crucial point is understanding that obedience will not always be comfortable. Sometimes God asks someone to forgive, even when they do not feel like it, or to give something before receiving, or to serve before being recognized. But every act of obedience is a seed planted. Those who ignore human logic and follow God's voice experience a provision they could never achieve on their own. Joseph, for example, was sold as a slave but remained faithful, and his obedience led him to govern Egypt. God always honors those who trust and act. The problem is that society values logic more than faith. The world teaches that everything must be planned out before taking action. But God works differently. He asks for obedience first and reveals the details later. Those who wait for everything to make sense before acting will probably never move forward. But those who understand that faith and obedience go hand in hand will see doors open in ways they never imagined. God does not need human guarantees to act. He needs people who trust Him. At the end of the day, the question is not whether God can do something, but whether someone is willing to obey. Faith is not just believing in miracles. It is positioning oneself to experience them. Those who learn to listen and obey without questioning every detail will see God transforming impossible situations. In the end, faith that manifests in obedience not only changes circumstances but also transforms those who practice it. And that is the key to living a truly impactful life. God's story with humanity has always followed a curious pattern. He chooses those whom the world ignores. While people value appearance, influence, or skills, God looks at the heart. David was the youngest among his brothers, a simple shepherd, yet he was chosen to be king. Moses was not eloquent, yet he led an entire nation. Jesus' disciples were fishermen and tax collectors, yet they changed the world. This proves that God does not follow human criteria when raising someone up. He uses those whom no one expected. The curious thing is that many people spend their lives waiting to become worthy of a calling. But God does not choose the qualified, He qualifies the chosen. When Samuel went to anoint the future king of Israel, all of David's brothers seemed more prepared. But God rejected them all and chose the one who was not even invited to the meeting. This teaches that no one needs human approval to live out what God has planned. If He has chosen someone, it is because He has already placed within them everything necessary for the mission. Think about stories of people who were once doubted but are now role models. There are preachers who were once considered incapable, but because they trusted in God's calling, their ministries grew. Entrepreneurs who started from nothing without support, but moved forward by faith and now inspire multitudes. The common factor in these stories was not exceptional talent or a privileged background but the willingness to say yes when God called. This shows that it doesn't matter where someone comes from, but rather where God wants to take them. But why does God choose the unlikely? Because it is in these vessels that His glory is manifested without distractions. If Moses had been a great speaker, people would have said he freed Israel because of his eloquence. If Gideon had a great army, they would have claimed he won by his own strength. But God reduced Gideon's army to just 300 men to make it clear that the victory came from him. The same happens in life. God allows certain limitations to exist so that it is evident that He was the one who made it happen, not human ability. Many people give up on their purpose because they think they are not good enough. They believe their past is a problem, that their mistakes disqualify them. But the Bible is full of people who failed before they were lifted up. Peter denied Jesus 3 times but became a pillar of the church. Paul persecuted Christians but wrote a large part of the New Testament. Those who choose to trust in God instead of focusing on their failures become His instruments to accomplish great things. Another essential point is that the unlikely ones are often those who understand God's grace the most. They know they were not chosen by merit but by love. This keeps them humble and dependent on Him. While the world seeks self-affirmation and status, those whom God raises know that their strength comes from Him. And this awareness makes them unshakable. When someone understands that they don't need to prove anything to others but only fulfill what God has commanded, they become free to live out their calling without fear. At the end of the day, the question is not whether someone is qualified but whether they are willing to trust. God has always used ordinary people to do extraordinary things. What defines someone is not what the world sees but what God has already decided. And when He calls someone, no past, external opinion or personal limitation can stop it. All that is needed is a willing heart, because when God raises up an unlikely person, no one can bring them down. Life is made of choices, and how someone responds to God's calling defines the course of their story. Many people spend years chasing success and recognition, but true fulfillment does not come from human approval. It comes from obedience to God's purpose. Joseph was betrayed and sold into slavery, but his faithfulness to God led him to govern Egypt. David was ignored by his own family, but he kept trusting in the Lord, and that led him to the throne. What do these stories teach us? That true success is the result of walking in God's will. One of the keys to spiritual and emotional growth is choosing wisely who you surround yourself with. Many people have great dreams but are surrounded by the wrong voices, people who only discourage and criticize. Proverbs 13 verse 20 says, "Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm." This means that if someone wants to grow, they need to be around those who build them up. If they want to move forward in faith, they must connect with people who push them higher, not those who pull them down. Another essential principle is learning to trust God even when circumstances seem unfavorable. How many times has someone tried to open doors by their own strength and ended up frustrated? This happens because some paths may seem right to human eyes but do not lead to the destiny God has prepared. Instead of struggling alone, the best strategy is to trust that God will open the right doors at the right time. When a person surrenders their plans to Him, they discover that what seemed impossible happens in unexpected ways. Many believe they need to understand the entire process before taking a step of faith. But the truth is, God does not reveal the whole plan at once. If Noah had waited to understand every detail of the rain before building the ark, he would never have started. If Abraham had demanded guarantees before leaving his homeland, he would not have become the father of a great nation. The key is to obey first and trust that God will show the next step at the right time. Moreover, it is essential to learn to face challenges without losing heart. Walking with God does not mean the absence of difficulties, but rather the certainty that He is present in every obstacle. When Moses stood before the Red Sea, the path seemed impossible. But God did not bring him there to abandon him. The same happens in life. When someone faces barriers, they must remember that if God brought them this far, He will also provide the solution. Faith is not the absence of challenges. It is the conviction that God has already prepared deliverance. Another crucial point is never underestimating small beginnings. Many people give up because they think they are making slow progress. But God always works through processes. A seed does not become a tree overnight. David's small flock was his preparation for leading a kingdom. Joseph's years in prison prepared him to govern a nation. What seems small today may be the foundation for something great tomorrow. The key is to be faithful in the little so that God can entrust the much. In the end, the greatest lesson is that the path to success and fulfillment is not in seeking human recognition but in remaining faithful to God. Those who learn to ignore negative voices, trust that God will open the right doors, value the process, and stand firm despite challenges will see God's plan unfold in extraordinary ways. The calling is not about having all the answers but about trusting the one who has them all. And those who choose this path never regret it. What is truly keeping you from living God's best? Is it the fear of what might go wrong? The insecurity about the future? Or perhaps that inner voice that keeps reminding you of past failures? Whatever the barrier may be, one thing is certain. God has already prepared a way for you to move forward, but the decision to take the next step is yours. Moses had to trust before the sea parted. David had to face Goliath before becoming king. Peter had to cast his nets again before witnessing the miracle of the catch. Nothing changed until they decided to act in faith. The truth is that many people wait to feel ready before obeying God, but that feeling never comes. If Moses had waited to become a great speaker, he would never have spoken to Pharaoh. If Gideon had waited to feel strong, he would never have led an army. Faith is not based on what one feels but on what one believes. Doubt may scream, circumstances may seem unfavorable, but when God gives a direction, He has already prepared everything needed to fulfill the promise. What He expects is a response. And perhaps that response begins with a simple decision. Stop listening to the wrong voices. How many dreams have been buried because someone believed more in criticism than in what God had already placed in their heart? How many times has fear paralyzed when faith should have been the guide? Do not allow negative words or difficult circumstances to define your destiny. What God has prepared for your life cannot be erased by anyone's opinion. The only voice that truly matters is His. If today you feel like something is holding you back, ask yourself, is this greater than the God who called me? The answer will always be no. No limitation, no past mistake, no opposing opinion has more power than the one who wrote your story. So why remain bound to what should have already been left behind? God's invitation has always been clear. Come, follow me, trust. The question is, are you willing to take that step? At the end of the day, the choice between standing still and moving forward will always be in your hands. God has already done His part. He has called, equipped, and prepared the way. But no one can walk it for you. Perhaps it's time to break free from the chains of doubt, insecurity, and fear and finally live out what God has for your life. The question is not whether He can, but whether you are ready to trust.